This is what they call a crescendo in the field of music, particularly in classical music for the day. So Shashi is here, and we hope that there will be music after you speak. He needs no introduction. He's a fine speaker. He's a great writer, more prolific. You often wonder how many more books he would write if he was not a full-time politician. And sometimes I wonder whether you're a full-time writer or a full-time politician. But today he's going to speak to us about why dissent is a right, necessary, whatever. So this morning, quite serendipitously, I read Voltaire, who said that it is dangerous to be right when the government is wrong. And so on that note, I wanted to sort of provoke you also a bit. Is dissent itself enough? And the subject of the season is really CAA and other acronym soups like NPR and NRC, and a lot of people confuse NRC with NPR. And since the Congress government had implemented the NPR, is the Congress party against the NPR? What's the way out? So the general drift is that politics cannot be an argument industry. So we should have some solutions, some ideas to take this forward, and maybe that will win you the next election. Not you personally, but the party. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Shashi Tharoor.
Thank you, Shankar, and thank you all for that warm welcome. Good evening to everybody. Yes, they wanted me to speak about why dissent matters, and it seems a very good time to be discussing dissent because, as Shankar was saying, dissent is indeed very much in the air today. But rather than answer his specific question, which I'm quite willing to do right away, let me just lay out a few basic general thoughts and leave the rest of the time to your questions. What I would really value would be an interaction with all of you as to what's in your mind, and feel free to dissent from whatever I have to say, and I would be happy to push back as well. And at that point, I'll also go into the details of why the Congress's NPR is not apparently the BJP's NPR. But we can address all of those later. I wanted to really situate the topic within a certain framework that corresponds to my understanding of why dissent is important in a democracy like ours, and then we'll have an interaction. So I'm not going to take a whole lot of time, but I'm just going to try and lay out the basics for you. Now, I'm starting with the premise that democracy is a process, not an event. That is, democracy is not about merely electing leaders every 5 years. Jayaprakash Narayan famously, when he quit politics in the early 50s, said that democratic politics in India is all about the sheep electing their shepherd, who then pushes them around for the next 5 years. That cannot be democracy, and he was right about that. And the truth is, democracy is a process that involves continuous civic participation between elections, with an obligation for the elected leaders to be accountable to those who've elected them. It's an ongoing process, an active process, an ongoing conversation between the rulers and the ruled. Otherwise, it's not democracy. And to my mind, that's what this whole cliche, famous lines of Lincoln about of the people, by the people, for the people. It's that the government alone does not have all the answers. The government has to be responsive to the people throughout until the next election, and very much indeed, the people exercise the right to then turf the government out after 5 years, but it doesn't mean that during those 5 years they have a free pass to do what they want to do. Dissent comes into this because dissent then becomes the way in which one shows the government that there is disagreement with what they are doing and saying. It kindles civic virtue. It actually helps inform members of society of alternative ways of thinking about issues that the government is giving you one view about. Thereby, it helps the public to evaluate all these points of view, the government's as well as that of the dissenters, to evaluate the workings of the government and indeed to form their own opinions. Dissent also is a reflection of the fundamental principle of democracy, which is freedom of expression. When you have the right to express your views, those views are inevitably not going to be the same views as what you're hearing from the ministers or the Prime Minister every day, and that's where dissent becomes part of your freedom of expression. Constructive criticism of the government itself is often a form of dissent because it's assuming that the government isn't right, at least on the specific issue on which you're disagreeing with it, and that's where dissent comes in. And of course, one could say that this has a very well-established tradition in our country going back to the freedom struggle. The freedom struggle itself was a fundamental act of dissent against British colonial rule. But if you want to go back to the Buddha's dissent against the Hindu orthodoxy of the day, if you want to go back to Adi Shankara's dissent against the Buddhist orthodoxy of the day, if you want to go back to Swami Vivekanand, to Ambedkar, talking about his objections to Manuvad and to casteism, and Mahatma Gandhi's arguments against the British from start to finish. All of these suggest that dissent has had a hallowed place in our traditions, and if anything, it is a betrayal of that legacy for us today to start demonizing dissent as our government has tended to do. And this is something that troubles me because what's happening with our government has been that it has a very uncomfortable relationship with dissent and dissenters. This seems to cut across the board. Students, of course, and we know from our newspapers, and indeed Shankar mentioned it in his introduction, that students who in many ways have been at the forefront of dissent in every society where dissent is permitted, whether it was students dissenting against the Vietnam War in America in the late 60s, early 70s, whether it's students in France in 1968, essentially leading a revolution in the streets that precipitated the premature resignation of President Charles de Gaulle, or whether it's students today in Jamia Millia, in JNU, in other campuses, AMU and elsewhere in the country, who have stood up saying that they don't agree with the government. The dissent can range from objections to the controversial Citizenship Amendment Act, it can to something far more basic for the students like hostel fees at JNU. But the fact is that the protests have been traditionally across the world, in democracies across the world, often led by students, and we're seeing that today. And sadly, we're seeing in response police brutality against the students. We saw it at Jamia just a couple of weeks ago, 10 days ago. We saw it in JNU, not police brutality yesterday and Sunday in JNU, but rather police indifference, while others wearing very inadequate masks marched in to inflict their brutality on the students. And then, of course, young people have, through this range of protests, been able to demonstrate their own faith in their inalienable rights of free speech. And by expressing their dissent, they have given people like me hope in the democratic future of India. Because what's going on with the students today is both completely spontaneous and organic. On the one hand, it's not led by politicians. You've seen that. Politicians have held rallies against the Citizenship Amendment. I myself have led half a dozen rallies in Kerala. But we are essentially addressing political workers. The students are out there on their own. They don't particularly welcome or need political leadership because they're speaking from the heart and they're speaking for the innermost convictions. Of all the tweets I've issued on the CAA, one that stuck in my mind as being particularly searing was the girl at Jamia Millia screaming, and this was, the video itself is there on my Twitter feed from 10 days ago if you want to see it, screaming at the police, "I'm a law student. You have broken into my girls' hostel and beaten us. You've invaded our library." tomorrow is my constitution exam. What have you left of the constitution for me to write in my exam? And this is coming from the heart. It's not a political script. In fact, the divisive politics of this government has provoked a dissent that is actually a dissent against the government, not a dissent against the country, because it is profoundly in support of the values of the Constitution of India, the values of equality, of secularism, of liberalism, all of which are being trampled upon by the government's policies of the Citizenship Amendment Act and their proposed NRC. And so dissent in this particular context is particularly proudly nationalist. They sing the national anthem. They don't sing Inkilab Zindabad or overthrow this government. They're singing the national anthem to say that what they are saying is deeply anchored in the values of our freedom struggle. So the government has a very deeply uncomfortable relationship with these dissenting dissenters. But it's not only the students that they're uncomfortable with. They're uncomfortable with those who would be more active in their opposition to the government. It's shocking and dismaying that the country with the worst record of internet shutdowns is India. We are a democracy, supposedly. We have shut down dissent in Kashmir by turning off the internet for 150 days. But even in other places, ranging from Assam to the nation's capital, the government's hair-trigger response to any risk of opposition and dissent appears to be to turn off the internet, to shut down mobile towers, to interrupt communications. This is a disgrace, and yet it's something we're all living with. And it's of course, in Assam it lasted 5 days, in Delhi it lasted 5 hours, but the fact that it happens at all is deeply shame-making. And it reflects again the fear of the government about allowing the expression of contrary views. And we are seeing in many, many cases that dissent takes forms other than the form of merely speaking out. You have, for example, the university gold medalist in Pondicherry University who refused to accept her medal from a governor because she felt the governor embodied support for this undemocratic law. You have the image of a group of Hindus forming a human chain around a large number of Muslims when they wanted to offer namaz. So they were offering namaz, and in a sort of act of solidarity and protection, you find a large number of Hindus standing in front, allowing them to pray in peace. That's also a form of dissent. You have indeed international equivalents of that. You've seen, for example, the American athlete who refused to stand up for the national anthem and instead sank to his knees as a form of protest. Or you remember the gold medalist, the black athlete in Mexico City in '68, who, protesting the treatment of his people, raised a fist at the time that the gold medal was being put around his neck. These are also acts of dissent. It doesn't necessarily involve speaking out all the time. And the mere fact that these protesters today are standing up and continuing day after day in the face of all the forces of intimidation arrayed against them by the Indian state, this is something that is particularly welcome in our country, because it is more than the routine protests and dharnas, the routine short-lived agitations, the routine relay fasts that we have got used to seeing from the political class. What is the government's answer? It's to demonize and discredit dissent as illegitimate. They describe dissenters as anti-nationals. They invent new terms, the tukde gang, the urban nationals. What does the tukde mean? It means cutting up the country into bits. Who is actually trying to divide the country on the grounds of religion, region, language? It's the government, not the dissenters. The dissenters want to stand for a united India that keeps everyone together, irrespective of Hindu or Muslim, North or South, Hindi speaking or Tamil speaking. It's the government that draws these distinctions and has done so in pursuance of a narrow-minded political agenda. The tukde gang are the ones ruling us, not the ones opposing them. But this has become now an effective propaganda tool. You can't handle dissent, you can't respond to dissent, so you label dissent in ways that will put people against them. And we've been seeing it since 2014. Kanhaiya Kumar was the famous poster boy for the crushing of dissent at one point. But as recently as this last year, we had a policeman on the judge's instructions filing an FIR against 49 prominent artists and intellectuals for the crime of writing a letter to the Prime Minister asking him to stop the increasing number of lynchings in the country in the name of cow protection. Now, fortunately, the FIR was eventually rescinded, but it shows you the reflexive attitude to dissent. If 49 intellectuals in this country can't write respectfully to our Prime Minister, saying there are people being lynched, human lives being taken in the name of the cow, please speak out against it, please stop it. And that then becomes seen as an anti-national act that merits an FIR, then you can realize in what perilous slope we are slipping down as far as dissent is concerned. I wrote to the Prime Minister at that time myself, and I invited as many members of the public as possible to do so. And a couple of sentences from my letter was this: our great country is built on the bedrock of coexistence of diverse and often diverging views and ideologies. This is what makes India a vibrant and successful democracy. Those who criticize or have opposing views to yours should not be deemed anti-national or enemies. If we are all blind to the problems that exist and impact Indian citizens, we risk betraying the values enshrined in our Constitution. And this is a particular problem we have because dissent is indispensable in India because of the nature of our society. As we all know, we are a country of enormous diversity and pluralism. India imposes no narrow conformities on its citizens, not even in the very nature of our Indianness. You can be many things and one thing. You can be a good Tamil, a good Muslim, and a good Indian all at once. The point is that we, unlike, for example, the Yugoslavs, I dealt with the Yugoslav civil war in my UN days, where, as the Freudians observed, the Yugoslavs were going to war over the narcissism of minor differences. They were all descended from the same Slavic tribes that settled the Balkan Peninsula in the 7th century, and yet they were butchering each other, often people with the same names, the same blood. In India, unlike the narcissism of minor differences, we have always celebrated the commonality of major differences. We are a land of belonging rather than of blood. When Tagore spoke of the idea of India, he was talking about a land, one land embracing many. The idea that a nation may endure differences of caste, of creed, of color, culture, cuisine, conviction, costume and custom, and still rally around a consensus. And that consensus had to be around a very simple principle, that in a large and diverse country like India, you don't really need to agree all the time, so long as you agree on the ground rules of how you will disagree. That is where dissent comes in. It's the reason that India has survived all the stresses and strains that have beset it for more than 70 years, and that led so many foreign observers in the early years after independence to predict India's imminent disintegration, and they were wrong, is because we knew how to maintain consensus on how to manage without consensus. It is sad that 7 decades after independence, for the first time, we have a government that no longer respects the ground rules of how we can disagree. A government that does not respect dissent is actually betraying a foundational pillar of our democracy. Because if you don't allow others to criticize you, or you say that your criticism is illegitimate because the nation is the government and the government is the ruling party and the ruling party is the prime minister, then you're getting down to the days of a Führer or a Duce rather than a democracy in a large, diverse land like India. And so, if I can repeat something that I said many years ago and has been quoted often enough, so you may have already be familiar with it, but my argument when I was in America and speaking about India there, I would say, look, you guys may be a melting pot, we're not. We in India, we are a thali. We are a collection of different dishes. sumptuous dishes but in different bowls. Each tastes different, and because each is in a separate bowl, it doesn't flow into the next. It does not even necessarily mix with the next, but they belong together on the same platter, and they combine together and complement themselves on your palate to give you a satisfying repast. That is India. And therefore, India is a land that seeks to celebrate its diversity and its historically rich and pluralistic traditions. This government, for example, swears by Swami Vivekanand, completely hypocritically, because they haven't actually imbibed anything that he has taught them. But if you read Swami Vivekanand, and since he did most of his preaching in English, I can claim to have read him in the original and not through some translation from Sanskrit. Swami Vivekanand spoke very, very powerfully of one fundamental idea. He said when he spoke in Chicago in 1893 at the World Parliament for Religions, said, "I'm proud to speak of you on behalf of a nation and a religion that has taught the world not just tolerance but acceptance." What does that mean? I read that as a teenager and it stayed in my mind. I've been thinking about it ever since. We all went to school and learned that tolerance is a virtue, right? In our history books, we're told a tolerant king is a good king because he allows other people to live in his kingdom and so on. But when you really think about it, tolerance is a pretty patronizing idea. The tolerant king or the tolerant ruler, or today the tolerant prime minister, what do they want? They say, I have the truth, you are in error, but I will magnanimously allow you the right to be wrong. That's essentially what tolerance is all about. But what is Swami Vivekananda preaching? He's preaching acceptance. And what is acceptance? Acceptance says, I believe I have the truth. You believe you have the truth. I will respect your truth. Please respect my truth. That is the essence of democracy as well. That is where dissent comes in. This is what I believe should be done. I have been elected by all of you to do it. You disagree with me. I respect your right to disagree with me. If I'm wrong, please vote against me. But in the meantime, continue speaking out your objections to me, and I will listen to you with respect. That idea of dissent, which I would argue is what Vivekananda celebrated, it's what Mahatma Gandhi lived, and it's the dissent that we have traditionally enjoyed as our right in this democracy. Indeed, if it weren't for this kind of dissent, our present government would never have been elected in 2014 because they came to power on the backs of many years of dissent against the UPA, including the extraordinary Anna Hazare movement, which captured the imagination of the cities and the urban middle class in this country and helped to discredit the government we had. All of this essentially occurred because dissent has been respected in this country and allowed to flourish. So what I want to celebrate, as I'll conclude here and take your questions, is that dissent is indispensable in India because we are one nation made up of many different kinds of people. An India where it does not matter what kind of religion you practice, what language you speak, what caste you were born into, what color your skin is. In a truly democratic India, it should only matter that you are Indian, that we don't have a Hindi, Hindutva, Hindustan idea of India, which is what the government is trying to propagate, but rather an idea of India which respects all religions, all faiths, all beliefs, all languages, all cultures, all regions, all castes, all classes. They want uniformity, we want unity. Their emphasis on uniformity will destroy our unity. And that's where dissent remains so indispensable. We must be able to preserve dissent if we want to preserve a society that derives strength from all sections of society, if we are able to remain an open society, a rich and diverse and plural civilization that we've been proud to lay claim to for 2,000 years, then we must be open to the contention of ideas and interests within it. We should be unafraid of dissent, unafraid of the prowess or the products of the outside world or of our inside colleagues, and stick to the democratic pluralism that the world has rightly seen as India's greatest strength. An India that allows and respects dissent, that is determined to liberate and fulfill the creative energies of its people, is an India that will succeed, but it will only succeed if we can remain true to the founding values of our great leaders of the 20th century, of Gandhiji and Nehru and Jayaprakash Narayan and Maulana Azad and Dr. Ambedkar and every other one of those great leaders who dissented openly and showed that dissent is a source of strength for India, not of weakness. If we remain faithful to their founding values of the 20th century, only then will we be able to conquer the challenges of the 21st. Thank you very much. I'll take your questions now. Jai Hind. And I'll start with Shankar's question since I didn't answer it. The NPR, the NRC, and the CAA. Very simply, the CAA, on the face of it, the way the government is trying to sell it is, all we're trying to do is to give refuge to people who are terribly persecuted because of their religion in 3 countries in the neighborhood. To which our answer is, what did Vivekanand say? Vivekanand said, I'm proud to stand here on behalf of a nation that has offered persecution and that has offered refuge and safe haven to the persecuted of all nations and faiths. Why don't you have a refugee law that will welcome any persecuted person, as all other democracies do, of any nation and any faith? No. You want a law that will only restrict it to 3 nations and 6 faiths, but not other faiths. What is the logic behind that? Is it not discriminatory? No answer. BJP talks about being faithful to our traditions, even being faithful to the UN. They're not being faithful to the UN conventions at all. The UN conventions speak about persons with a fear of persecution. They do not speak of people by religion. In fact, there are people of the Muslim faith who have been persecuted in these Muslim countries. We ourselves have given refuge to some of them in the past. So why pass a law that leaves them out? It makes absolutely no sense at all. Secondly, the Home Minister made it very clear in Parliament in speeches in both houses that the CAA was a precursor to the NRC and that the purpose of the CAA was to facilitate the NRC. Now you look at what happened. The only state in which the NRC was applied was Assam, in which what happened? They thought they would be eliminating a large number of Bengali Muslims, and they found that if you applied the strict criteria of the NRC of documentation proving you were born in India and so on, then you also excluded a large number of Bengali Hindus, plus a few others. I think of the 1.9 lakh, 190,000 people who fell afoul of the Assamese NRC, some 31,000 were Hindus, and there were a few other thousand Christians, Sikhs, Buddhists, etc. So the government said, oh my gosh, we better have a law that protects those people. Now, what does that mean? If you then have a nationwide NRC, as Amit Shah said you would, you will be requiring people throughout the country to produce documentation. Who gets left out? You tell me. First of all, the vast majority of our country doesn't have birth certificates. It is estimated that at least 65% of our population has no birth certificates for themselves, let alone for their parents or their grandparents. The poor, the marginalized, the slum dwellers, the rural, they're very poorly documented. We have a cabinet minister, a member of the Council of Ministers of Mr. Modi's government, General V.K. Singh, who when he was army chief went to the Supreme Court saying that he didn't have a birth certificate and the age given in his school certificate, which was recorded in the army register, was wrong. Now, when a minister is not able to prove his exact birth date, how are you expecting these poor Indians in your NRC to prove who they are and where they were born, or worse still, where their father was born? Well, if you are a Hindu, Buddhist, Sikh, Christian, etc., Parsi, you're going to be fine. The CAA says so. But if you are a Muslim and you have no documentation, it becomes very easy for people to say, how do we know you didn't come from Bangladesh or Pakistan? The guy says, I'm from West Bengal, or I'm from somewhere else in North India. The onus will be on him to prove his innocence. Whereas, in fact, the government can simply say that the lack of documentation in your case makes you ineligible for citizenship, which they're not likely to say to somebody of one of the other faiths. That is what people are objecting to. It is the reduction of Muslims to second-class citizenship, not just by their omission from this bill, but by the next consequence of the NRC. Now, seeing these protests, the government has hastily backtracked. Our Prime Minister, who seems to have only a nodding acquaintance with the truth, says that there has been absolutely no discussion of the NRC. There are videos you can get on Google and YouTube of Mr. Amit Shah 2 speeches in Parliament, 6 or 7 interviews, various speeches outside, talking about the NRC and how it will be implemented after CA. How can Mr. Modi say that there's been no discussion of the NRC? But it's there. So now they have backtracked and said, we're only going to do an NPR. And as Shankar says, they're saying, oh, the Congress was starting the NPR. The NPR is a very interesting exercise. It was a decision of the Vajpayee government in 2003, the Congress government that came in 2004, and I was not a part of that government, so I'm only speaking from outside information. They said it's a useful thing to have a national population register of all residents in this country, so let's start the exercise. By the time UPA 2 happened, the government I joined, there was an even better idea. Let's have an Aadhaar card for all the residents of this country. And there was actually a clash within the UPA government whether the NPR and the Aadhaar wouldn't be duplicative of each other. And there was actually a bit of a de-emphasis on the NPR because the Aadhaar was doing more than the NPR was going to do because it had biometrics as well. But what did the NPR seek to do? Just to record who was residing in this country. Didn't ask citizenship, did not ask where your parents were born, where your grandparents were born, nothing. If you look at the BJP government's NPR rules, it's a different story. There is a list of questions, and the questions include specifically the question, where were your parents born? Mr. Shah is right, it doesn't ask for documentation at this stage. So you can say my parents were born here or there or whatever. But it is written down in the NPR rules of the BJP government, not the Congress's NPR, that where the citizenship of a resident is doubtful, a note shall be made and conveyed to the authorities. So the NPR of the BJP government is not the innocent exercise of the NPR of the UPA government. It is an exercise that is explicitly linked to the question of dubious citizenship. And that is why so many non-BJP governments are objecting to the NPR. Now, people are saying this is like objecting to the census. Not true. The census is passed under one law, the Census Act. The NPR is under a different law, the Citizenship Act. So the government is state governments are fully within their rights to say we will conduct a census under the Census Act, but we will not conduct an NPR under the Citizenship Act. That is the issue. That is the difference between the Congress's approach and the BJP's, and the decisions of states like Kerala and West Bengal not to cooperate in the NPR is based on this difference between the NPR and the census. I hope that's been clear, but if there are other questions, we're very happy. You want to do it from there? Is there a mic or a handheld mic? Oh, there is. Okay, then I'll do it from there. Raise your hands, I'm sure somebody will identify.
Good evening, Dr. Tharoor.
I want
Good
to
evening.
first, just hang on a minute. I'll call one by one.
Yes.
No rush.
Yeah.
She's here with us for some time. You'll be here for some time. You have no flight to catch. So I just wanted to sort of extend this issue about dissent. You wrote recently about how Nehru accepted Vajpayee's demand for a separate session post the 1962 war. And that was Nehru's approach to dissent. Mrs. Gandhi's approach to dissent, we all know 18 months, ADM Jabalpur, Jayaprakash Narayan being arrested. Then we know Rajiv Gandhi's approach to dissent. He tried to bring in the Anti-Defection Law against the press. How does the Congress, now this is a question that I wanted to take to you because dissent has to also have a context in not taking away the right to dissent, but how does the Congress explain this dichotomy?
This is what they call trolling, except that it's being done not on social media, but in front of you all. Let me say very clearly, I joined the Congress party in 2009. And in Kerala, we have all these open-air debates. So my opponents would religiously put somebody in the front row of the debates with a copy of the Malayalam edition of my books to read aloud as part of their question my criticisms of the emergency in the Congress government of that time. And I would say truthfully, I'm fighting the elections of 2009, not of 1977. In 1977, I would have voted against the Congress. And had I been a candidate, it would not have been for the Congress. I'm not a fan of the emergency. And I'm not a fan of the Sikh riots of '84. And all of these things I said at that time I wrote them at that time, and I stand by my words. I hope, because I have such a long paper trail in this country, that people can judge me by what I've said in the past. I have been consistently and unfailingly committed to liberalism, democracy, pluralism, diversity, social justice. I mean, there have been some core principles that I've always stood up for, always written for, and my track record is there. I'm not saying I'm in any way perfect. I'm not proud of every single thing I've said or done, but at least on these principles that I've lived by, I have not changed or wavered. It so happens that today the Congress Party is the best embodiment of those principles, whereas the BJP is not. And to my mind, if you're defending principles, you have to defend them against those who would threaten those principles. I do believe that this government, by, for example, undermining the fundamental notion that we never bought into the logic of partition, that India was never meant to be about the notion that religion can determine your nationhood, which was the Pakistani idea. Our rejection of that idea meant that all religions have to be equal in this country, that people of all backgrounds are equally empowered in our democracy. And that belief is something that is fundamental. I mean, frankly, I would not wish to be a part of India, an India that enshrined either a particular religion as a state religion to the disadvantage of others, or that discriminated officially against a particular caste or a particular region or whatever of people. I celebrate an India that is equally accessible to all. That was the conclusion of my speech to all of you today. So my message remains that very simply. If we want an India that we all cherish and value, it has to be the India that Mahatma Gandhi fought to free, not the India that Mr. Modi and Mr. Shah are trying to establish as their new India, as they call it. I'm quite happy with the old India, which certainly needed improvement, needed reform, needed transformation, but did not need undermining its fundamental and most noble tenets.
I won't do a follow-up on that because I don't want Shashi to say this is troll number 2, but there's a girl there in the red shirt. No, gentlemen, we follow a certain principle, the young lady there, and then you keep standing, I'll call you. Keep standing, I'll call you. Please introduce yourself and ask a question.
Good evening, sir. This is Radha Vardarajan. I'm from MOP Vaishnav. Thank
Sorry,
you so much.
are you a student?
Yeah, I'm a student.
Great.
I have a small question. Why do an NPR when we're going to have a census in 2021? They're going to get the same data anyway.
It's a very good question. And to my mind, it was not at all clear from the Vajpayee government's decision of 2003 why they felt an NPR was more valuable than just a census. It's possible that they felt that an NPR would have a few more details, but it was not at that point done with the kind of intention that, in any case, by the time the Vajpayee government passed this decision, within 1 year it had lost the election, so it was not in a position to write the rules to implement it. But they never, in any case, took steps to say specifically that this was about checking whether people had dubious citizenship. It's only the present BJP government that have linked the NPR to dubious citizenship. I would say very strictly that the census is enough for the kinds of purposes that an NPR accommodates, and that if you want more details, get them in the Aadhaar, you've got them. And particularly, I remember Mr. Chidambaram explaining the logic of the Aadhaar was to be able to facilitate the transfer of benefits, governmental entitlements that people had. For example, people below the poverty line, people eligible for certain subsidies, students getting scholarships. If you had Aadhaar details, you could remit the benefits directly to them and bypass the potential middleman who might rake off some stuff. Plus, you could weed out the fake claimants, because, you know, a fake claimant wouldn't have fingerprints and iris scan and photograph and so on. And that logic seemed to me to make sense. But I would agree with you that there is something superfluous about the NPR when you've got both the Aadhaar and the census.
Let me just add to that. There is a context to why the NPR came up, and having written a book on Aadhaar, I can sort of expand on this.
Yeah, please.
Is that after the 1999 Kargil war, the K.S. Subramaniam committee gave a lot of recommendations. One of that was for a national identity card, which became an NPR. And by the time Aadhaar came, Aadhaar was NPR on steroids, basically because it had biometric data. And so technically speaking, 125 crore people living in this country are already on an NPR on a platform called the UIDAI. So technically speaking, the NPR exercise need not happen. Only those who are not having an Aadhaar card. Because what does the National Population Register say? It says that you're a resident of this country. It doesn't say you're a citizen of this country. There is a distinction. So just before I go to that gentleman.
No, which is why I was saying census and Aadhaar should be enough.
Yeah. And before I go to that gentleman there who's standing patiently, Shashi, the one question that I wanted to ask you. The National Population Register is under the Citizenship Act. The Citizenship Act under Schedule 7 of the Constitution says it's a central, it is under the center. So there is a buzz among the BJP and in people in government that states that refuse to implement the NPR will be hauled up, they will be denied allocations, there could be 356 and, governor's diktat, president's directive, all of this could happen. You have now quite a few states the Congress is ruling in coalition and on their own. How would the Congress deal with that?
Well, let me say, first of all, that the central government cannot even conduct a census without the cooperation of the state government. State government will ask its employees, school teachers, and others drawing salaries from the state government to actually do the work, the legwork of going door to door and collecting the information. So if the state government says that our employees are not going to go out and do the NPR work, I think in practice it cannot be implemented. So if you're saying the threat is they'll dismiss the government and impose presidential rule, they may have a major public uproar on their hands. And the question is they have to ask themselves whether this is really worth it. I know that the two states that have publicly declared they will not cooperate, which are Kerala and West Bengal, are not Congress-ruled states. They're both other parties, left and TMC respectively. But I know the Congress is extremely negative at the moment about it. And if I'm not mistaken, at least two Congress chief ministers, Rajasthan and Chhattisgarh, have spoken negatively about the idea of conducting this. Whether they have actually said, we will not cooperate, I have not checked and seen. But the two who have openly said they will not cooperate are West Bengal and Kerala. Both governments, I think, if they are dismissed on this issue, there will be a major uprising in the streets, which I hope any responsible government in Delhi will rethink. I think it's important for them to realize that this is a large and diverse country, and you don't just impose your will without paying attention to why people are objecting. So to my mind, what you're saying is alarming. I mean, president's rule hasn't been imposed anywhere for quite some time other than Kashmir for a particular reason.
It ranges from denial of PDS.
Well, on that you've seen Kerala has already passed a resolution decrying the CAA, and in revenge, the government has denied it flood relief funds. And what is more, the Kerala governor has already come, or is he coming tomorrow to this conference? I hope somebody will ask him how he feels about representing a central government that has denied flood relief to one of the worst hit flood-affected states in the country over the last 2 years, merely because of politics. I mean, this is not the cooperative federalism our Prime Minister spoke about. This is actually vindictive unitarianism on the part of the central government.
Young man, introduce yourself, ask your question.
Thank you, sir. I'm Adil Beg. Good evening, Mr. Shashi Tharoor. Chennai loves you.
Thank you. I love Chennai too.
Dr. Tharoor, you are having Nehruvian traits and characteristics. Why not run for 2024? And one more thing, another dimension of dissent with respect to the topic is the dissent which is lacking because of the anti-defection law to the parliamentarians like you. So how we can reform this anti-defection law to create a balance between dissent at one point and Ayaram, Gayaram at another side?
Very, very good questions. On the first one, I honestly, all I can say is that, ours a parliamentary system. There's no individual deciding to run. Parties have their own leadership, and my party has a leadership, and that's essentially where it is. So you're very kind to to talk about me individually, but I'm just playing my part. Whether I will contest in Trivandrum in 2024 also depends on the party. But 3 times the voters of Trivandrum have placed their faith in me, and I'll try not to let them down. But I do want to come back to your second question, because I have actually spoken publicly against the anti-defection law and written against it. You can read an essay by me in Open magazine called The Crisis of Representation about a year ago. Just Google that phrase. You'll see where I've talked about how the anti-defection law unfortunately resulted, there's a famous English expression, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. This had a good intention, which is to prevent unprincipled defections. But it's turned out to be the road to hell, because it means that MPs are no longer able to speak their conscience on any issue, because on every issue there is a whip and the anti-defection law applies. So whether or not they actually disagree with their party, they have no choice but to vote with their party. That's not the way the British parliamentary system works. Even on fundamental issues like the war with Iraq and so on, individual MPs were able to dissent from their own government. Labour Party MPs, including the Foreign Secretary, in those days, the late Foreign Secretary Robin Cook resigned and made a very, very emotional speech. And the Trade Secretary. And the Trade Secretary and others. As recently as 2 years ago, the entire shadow cabinet spoke against the Labour leader and quit because of their disagreement with him over a stand on a particular bill. But the whip would apply only when there's a vote of confidence involved. You can't dissent from your own government on the budget. The budget would then essentially fail, and the budget fails, the government has to resign. So there you can understand a whip. To have a whip for everything else, the anti-defection law means that the price for challenging a whip is not only that you can be expelled from your party, you can lose your seat in parliament. And no one who has worked long and hard and fought to get a seat in parliament is going to just lightly give it up over one issue, any one issue. There may be 10 different issues on which they agree with their party, so they'll bite their tongue and carry on. I don't know if there's an easy solution. I mean, the closest one can come to a solution, which I have also advocated, is to limit the anti-defection law's terms to to permit the whip only on specific issues, which would involve the confidence of the House in the government of the day, and that on other issues, MPs should be encouraged to vote their conscience. But the culture in our country has evolved to such a point that any MP who dissents too often, too openly with his own party leadership may in any case be vulnerable. It's just that it won't be by provision of law, it'll be by political convention. So the parliamentary system itself creates a certain premium on that. Most of our parties don't have enough intra-party democracy. We value democracy and dissent in the country as a whole, but within our institutions, we tend to prize loyalty and conformity over dissent. And that is a question that you're right to put your finger on, to which there is no easy answer.
And that by that he didn't necessarily mean about his own party, right, Shashi?
No, I'm just making a general observation.
Okay, Prabhu, you had a question?
Of course, I can't compete with Shashi because he has vast knowledge of everything. Few questions, because I'm not clear about what is CAA and what is NPR and what is... I want to ask only one question. I can appreciate the CAA could have been worded properly, better than it was done. They need not have defined the communities and religions.
Exactly. That was the point I made.
I agree with you on that point because I've written about it as well. But they did basically what your government has been doing in the past. Your chief ministers have been writing to the central government, give citizenship to section. Gehlot wrote a letter, Manmohan Singh wrote something. They have been writing, implementing law, but badly framed law. I concede that point. But I want to know from you, since you have traveled so much, you are an international personality, is there any country which doesn't have a citizen law?
Then of course, our law goes back to 1955.
Let me complete.
Yeah, we must have a citizenship.
Is there any country in the world which doesn't have a citizen register?
Citizenship register in that shape and form, I'm not sure many countries have.
So what kind of citizen register? Do you want a citizen register in India or not? There should be a difference between residents and citizens. How do you do that? I would like you to suggest to the government that, okay, we don't want this. But how do you define Indian citizens and Indian residents?
Let me put it this way. We have to take into account the realities of our country, Prabhu. When we have genuinely, for example, universal registration of births and deaths, where every single birth in every small tribal village in our country is officially recorded somewhere in a computer, then we can have a system that truly applies. But you have to always weigh the consequences of an ideal against the benefits of that ideal. My worry is, if you create a citizenship register in a country where even a minister doesn't have a birth certificate, you tell me how we are going to be able to satisfactorily establish that people are who they claim to be. My own gut instinct would be to say we just live with everyone we've got. Let people self-declare for now. If you want to create a register, let people self-declare and you take them at their word. If they say, I'm sorry, I've been living here, my parents are from here, etc., believe them. Rather than going through this incredibly iniquitous exercise, which has resulted in so many cases of injustice that your own paper has reported, for example, that Kargil war veteran called Muhammad Sanaullah who was denied, Fakhruddin Ali Ahmed's nephew who was denied. I mean, there have been so many cases because people can't produce pieces of paper. Our country is like that. Then what you can do is, after you accept everybody who's here, then prospectively, you set up systems whereby every single baby born in this country is automatically entered with a birth certificate into a national database, so that in a generation's time, you can have an actual, accurate, 100% foolproof register of citizens and have ID cards. But in today's India, with the kind of chaos of documentation that exists, would you not be creating colossal amounts of injustice?
Shashi, you are going into so many explanations. I am asking a very simple question. Does India need a register of citizens or not? You are going into documentation. Forget about documentation.
If you're willing to create a register of citizens today of everybody living in India who says he's Indian, that's fine.
No, there is anybody living in America is not American citizen.
Correct.
So why should everybody living in India should be Indian
Because
citizen?
there is nobody in America without a birth certificate.
Sorry?
Yeah, America won't have a cabinet member without
Everybody
a birth
living in Pakistan is not a Pakistani citizen.
certificate. That I don't know.
So that is what I'm saying. It means the Congress party stand is that there is no differentiation between citizens and residents. Is that your stand?
No, that's not my stand. No. Look, I am very much in favor of us identifying our citizens. All I'm saying is the means you choose to do so should not generate more injustice and the risk of discrimination and the risk of social disorder. So if you want a register of citizens tomorrow, draw one up tomorrow, but let people self-declare. Take their word for it. If you're prepared to do that, if you accept that VK Singh is an Indian because he says he's an Indian, that's good enough. He doesn't have to show a birth certificate.
This is a long debate. I don't want to get into it because that I wanted an answer. I have not got an answer. I have not got it. You may have got it. Thank you very much.
And then Prabhu, follow up with a good computerized system where every single person... Then you'll have a foolproof citizens register in 25 years, but today you will not be able to get... Because if you're going to draw up a citizens register by interrogating 130 crore people, believe me, you're going to create disaster and chaos in this country. So I would say, create a citizenship register if you want, but you ask people, where were you born? Trust them.
As far as I understood, the attempt is to identify citizens and residents. And you, the Congress party, is not able to, at least I am not clear whether you want to differentiate between the residents who can enjoy everything. They should not be thrown out of the country, but they should not be considered citizens of India till they go through the various rules and regulations which every other country in the world has. Even Saudi Arabia has got it.
We should be like every other country. We should have, for example, universal birth certificates. Do we have it? You tell me. And we are in the absurd position where our government now says that even producing a passport is not satisfactory proof of identity and of citizenship.
But that's
now,
not
we are expecting the world to accept our passport as a proof of citizenship, but within India, our own government doesn't accept it. What kind of logic is this?
No, it's not the government. It's actually a High Court ruling which says that the passport is not sufficient proof of citizenship. The Aadhaar card is actually proof only of residentship.
Correct.
The voter ID card has been declared as fake. So there is a documentation issue.
That's exactly
17% of births in this country are not registered.
Shankar, he must be knowing about it. When he talked about father's date of birth and place of birth, he must be knowing about it. I recently went to get a visa for my family and myself from a particular country I don't want to name, 3 countries in fact. Each one of them asked me about my father's date of birth and my father's place of birth. And whatever I wrote, they accepted it. When you go and apply to a country where you visit quite often and send your children for studies, they are asking you information about your father and your whatnot. And if our country asks it, We doubt the intention because the government, the way it behaves, people suspect it more than because their conduct is so suspect. Therefore, I can agree with you on that point.
That's my
but,
answer.
But when somebody else asks you the father's name, grandfather's name, because you go there, give your biometrics, give your children biometrics, give your eyes, you give everything, they take your entire body survey, you give it. But when your own government asks anything, you suspect it. That is what the attitude I am talking about.
No, Prabhu, we don't, please. Prabhu is being a bit demagogic here. When I myself made this point that people who are willing to go to get a US visa and surrender all this information, why can't they surrender to the government? I said that in the context of supporting the Aadhaar exercise. But the main difference is the US doesn't ask you for your father's birth certificate. I have seen the very corner of his old house where he was born, but I've never seen a birth certificate for him. If the government were to ask me to produce my father's birth certificate, I would fail. But I can certainly tell them the exact place and date and so on of the village in which he was born. The government has to trust me. If government wants me to trust the government in turn has to trust me. That's all I'm saying. Then we can all have a national register of citizens on that basis.
No. Students first. Student first. Okay, he answered that question earlier.
Yeah.
He said which countries have a citizen register. So.
No, let me answer the
Calm
question.
Calm down.
The answer very simply is that every country has its own system, but because ours sadly has been dogged by problems of poor documentation, that establishing a national citizens register will have to involve a great deal of willingness on the part of the government to trust the word of undocumented Indians. If instead we start investigating and challenging the bona fides of every undocumented Indian, we will create major problems and social unrest for individuals. That is the issue I'm talking about. And let's face it, none of our systems are perfect. In the Assam NRC case, we've actually had a case where of a pair of twins, one was given Indian citizenship and the other was left off the register. I mean, can you imagine how the government can justify it? But this is the way our government also works. So given the limitations of all this, given the human injustices that can often follow, don't you think the decent, humane thing to do is to have a national register of citizens, definitely, but not to do it by insisting on proofs that 65% of Indians today are unable to provide?
Okay, we have time for 2 questions. And the gentleman in the blue shirt who just asked the question, raising your voice and shouting at me. Sit down. Sit down. No, you can't bully. You can't bully me. Don't bully me. Okay, young lady behind, ask the question. The young lady.
Good evening, sir. Sir,
One mic to the young lady behind. Shh. Hello. We can speak like you. You don't want us to speak like us. You. Okay? Where's the mic? Okay. Ask. Identify yourself. After that, we'll take 3 questions and then that. So this young lady here, that young lady there, and the young man with the beard. 3. Done.
Good evening, sir. I am Khushi from SRM Institute of Science and Technology. My question is that, as the Home Minister has said that they will not take CAA back, but then what do you think that these student protests will lead to? Because these protests have given a negative image to students. They have been termed as anti-nationals and urban naxals and whatnot. So do you think that these will result in positive outcome?
See, the students are standing up for very lofty ideals and principles. They're not saying anything anti-national. As I pointed out in my remarks, they're even singing the national anthem at their protests. They're talking about defending the Constitution. My own view is that the best way out for all this would be when the Supreme Court reconvenes this week and listens to some of these petitions, for them to look at the ample evidence that has been presented by many of us and simply declare the CAA to be unconstitutional. That will solve the problem. The students can go back to their classrooms. Whether the Supreme Court will do that, I don't know. But to my mind, demonizing the students' dissent as anti-national, urban, Naxals, Tukre gang, and so on is deeply shameful, because none of them is anti-national. They're talking about defending the nation that they've grown up to love. They've talked about defending an India that is accessible to all, not an India that says, all right, provided you're not a Muslim. That's not the kind of India that the students are anxious to defend. So that's the principle that they're talking about, these students. And one of the anthems of the movement, for example, is this Varun Grover poem, Hum Kagaz Nahi Dikhayenge. We will not show papers. Even those who have papers should not show it. That's the message. Now, in that kind of argument, it is not at all anti-national. It is about actually standing up for the right thing. So the only way out, it seems to me, is for the government to acknowledge that it was wrong. And the purpose of these protests is to shame the government into recognizing they're wrong. Now, the government is not going to back down, and Mr. Shah and Mr. Modi don't have a great record of backing down. Then the only hope lies in the Supreme Court. The cases are before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court can, just studying the basic principles of the Constitution, Article 14, Article 15, there are many bases on which the Supreme Courts could say that this law doesn't pass the smell test, that it's an unconstitutional law. And if they do that, and the government has to go back to the drawing board, one of the amendments that I suggested, which Prabhu seems to agree with here, and I don't know if Prabhu is listening anymore, but anyway, the suggestion that I had made in Parliament was, you remove the reference to any particular religion, say all persons who are persecuted are eligible for consideration. That's the international standard. That's what other democracies have. That's what the UN has. That'll be the end of the matter. The Akali Dal made the same suggestion. They're allies of the BJP. So my suggestion is actually not so controversial. The government could easily do that and still, be very strict in figuring out who's being persecuted and who's not. But to actually write in the names of religions into a law, I would say there's a better than 50% chance that the court will find it unconstitutional. That's my hope.
The young lady there.
Good evening, sir. My name is Dibanjana. I'm from SRM Institute of Science and Technology. So I have a very small question.
Sorry, can you wave your hand? Where are you? Oh, right there. Okay, sorry. Right.
So I have a very small question. So with respect to the present media and the United Nations organizations, we have seen that there are different countries in and around India which has shown certain trends towards ethnic cleansing or anything related to a persecution, a particular sector of people or religion. Sir, do you think by any chance the Indian government has or somehow been influenced by the trend shown by certain countries around India which has showed these trends?
Sorry, I'm not sure I fully got
Last part. Just repeat the last part. We couldn't get.
Just summarize the question. I think I got some bits of it, but not the whole.
Okay, so there are countries around India which has shown certain trends towards ethnic cleansing.
Yeah.
Not taking names. However, do you think that the Indian government, by showing the CAA, is trying to show certain influence which it has got from the other countries?
No, I don't think so. I think if you were to take the government at its word, they're only anxious to offer refuge to persecuted minorities, which is not something we object to. I myself have spoken up for persecuted Pakistani Hindus, Bangladeshi dissidents, all of these people over the years in the past. And there's no, not only is there no shame in that, there should be pride in our country that we are offering a home to people who are being persecuted in our neighborhood. The problem is not that. The problem is the Hindutva ideology of the government. Because the government, unfortunately, has an ideology that particularly demonizes one religious community, the Muslims. I mean, they have got this perception that when partition happened and Pakistan was created as a country for Muslims, India should have become a Hindu Rashtra. And the Hindutva ideology, if you read, if in my book, Why I'm a Hindu, I've quoted at length from the writings of V.D. Savarkar, M.S. Gorwalkar, Deen Dayal Upadhyay. They all say that India should be a Hindu Rashtra. They say the constitution ought to be torn up and thrown away because it rests on the flawed premise, they all argue, of territorial nationalism. What is territorial nationalism? They're saying that the constitution assumes that India is a territory called India, and the constitution is written for all the different people on it. Wrong, they say, the Hindutva ideologues. Wrong, because a nation is not a territory, a nation is a people, and the people of India are the Hindu people, so the constitution should have been for a Hindu Rashtra. This is their belief. In the RSS, they've grown up with this belief. This is indoctrinated in their shakhas and in their teachings. So they have come to power believing that at bottom India is a Hindu Rashtra and the country should be for the Hindus alone. In fact, in their manifesto of 2014, they only said, we will give refuge to persecuted Hindus. When it was pointed out there are others also being persecuted, that's when they changed their law. The manifesto 2019 mentioned the other religions for the first time. So the BJP is following a particular set of beliefs that is independent of the other countries. But in the process, they are mirroring the logic that Gandhiji rejected. We rejected the idea in our nationalist movement, we rejected the idea that your religion determines your nationhood. We rejected the idea that there was a logic to create a country called Pakistan for people of one religion. We said, no, ours is a country where people of all religions can live and work together and dream the same dreams together. That's the India we've still tried to build and protect. That's what Mahatma Gandhi stood for, Nehru stood for, the Constitution reflects. And for 72 years, we've run India that way. Now they want to change that and demonize and marginalize one community. That's the problem.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, good evening, sir. This is Varun from, again, SRM Institute of Science and Technology. My question to you is more philosophical rather than political. In the recent weeks, as everyone knows, there's a raising voice of dissent throughout the country. But there are a lot of us who do not have an opinion about everything that goes on in the world. My question to you is hating on such people moral? What are your thoughts about the same?
No, you see, to be apolitical is a luxury at a time when so many fundamental issues are being contested. You have the right to be apolitical. But the problem with those who are apolitical is that they are condemned to being observers of a process rather than participants in it. At a time when our democracy gives you the opportunity and the right to participate in determining your own country's future destiny, being apolitical seems to me to be an abdication of responsibility. But I agree, you have the right to do that. And if you choose to be apolitical, no one has the right to hate you for that alone. That's entirely up to you. But I still would regret it. I would think that as a person of education and therefore of some consciousness awareness, you ought to take an interest in these issues because they're determining the lives and future of the country, of your friends and neighbors, and indeed of your family. Your children yet unborn may be growing up into an India that's shaped very differently by the decisions to which you are being indifferent today.
Being apolitical is not being without an opinion. So you must have an opinion, you must know. And if you don't step up to the plate and sort of put your word across, then tomorrow you can't blame anybody for what you are experiencing. This is the mistake that often happens in democracies which sort of go down the slope. So you might have a completely different view than what Shashi has expressed or what a lot of students have expressed. You might have a middle of the road opinion, but you must have an opinion. You cannot be saying that this doesn't concern me. I have a birth certificate, so I'm going home. Okay? So thank you, everybody.